Overclocking. We all know it, we've all tried it. But one question nobody ever seems to ask is, does it really matter? My computer, like many nowadays, is heavily CPU bottlenecked. And with custom water cooling and adequate power delivery, my computer seems like a prime candidate for overclocking. So it bears the question, can overclocking save me from needing an upgrade? And should you overclock? Well, I promise by the end of this video, we will have an answer, although it's much more surprising than it may seem. If you haven't already, remember to like the video and subscribe, and let's get right into it. So for our first set of tests here, we're gonna have below baseline, or what I'm gonna call clueless gaming. All motherboard settings are set to default, nothing has been changed in software, no overclocking of any kind, and no XMP, which is the biggest differentiator between this and actual default. Even though there was no XMP, my i9-10850K still managed a score of 830 in Cinebench 2024 multi-threaded core performance. However, I'm going to save our GPU performance for the next category because it doesn't matter. The RAM shouldn't affect the GPU clocks in any meaningful way, and this will carry on into the other tests too. However, today I am going to be benchmarking my RTX 3080 12GB on Unigine superposition. And lastly, for our real-world gaming performance benchmark, we have Modern Warfare 3's in-game benchmarking software. This below baseline setup was able to achieve an average FPS of 220.5 and a 1% low of 160 FPS. And now we have actual baseline, which is everything is still set to default except XMP is turned on. So this is something that you would see out of a boutique system builder, or if you went to Best Buy and picked up a computer. Most likely XMP would already be turned on from the factory if you bought any kind of pre-built computer. And with the XMP profile turned on, my RAM goes to 3200 megahertz, cast latency 16. Again, for Cinebench multi-core, we got a respectable score of 859, followed by a Unigine superposition score of 7118.5. Lastly, in Modern Warfare 3, we see an average FPS of 230.5 with a 1% low of 176 FPS. These numbers, as suggested, are going to be used as a baseline, and all other configurations of overclocking will be compared to this in the end, helping us determine the efficacy of overclocking. And if you want to be more effective, you should hit the subscribe button down below to try to help me hit my goal of 800 subscribers by the end of April. And here's the first actual category where we overclock something. This is what we're calling the balanced RAM profile. Here we're boosting the RAM megahertz from 3200 to 3600 and keeping everything else the same except for boosting the DRAM voltage up a little bit to maintain a stable overclock. We entered the Cinebench test with a multi-core score of 849, actually below baseline numbers, although it's within margin of error, so I'm not going to panic. And for the record, if there's a 0.5 or any weird numbers in any of these, all of these tests have been ran twice and then averaged out to try to help adjust for outliers. And then this is followed by a Modern Warfare 3 average FPS of 229.5 with a 1% low of 175.5 FPS. And again, remember, we're skipping the GPU test when the GPU is not explicitly edited. Next, we have our first extreme overclock. In this case, we are taking our RAM and again boosting it to 3600 megahertz. However, we are turning off the XMP profile for the express purpose of lowering our cast latencies across the board. So now it's 3600 megahertz CL15, not 16. And of course, accordingly, we are raising the DRAM voltage too. And again, the Cinebench scores don't really see an improvement. They come to about 855, which is better than last time, but again, within margin of error. And with the Modern Warfare 3 test, its average FPS is, well, average, coming in at 231 FPS with a 1% low of 178 FPS, which of course is a slight improvement. And with our RAM set back to original factory clocks, we enter our next set of overclocks, the CPU. This is the CPU balance profile, in which I have overclocked all cores to 5 GHz and put a negative 100 millivolt undervolt on the CPU to help adjust for temp and power reasons. And we start off strong with a Cinebench score of 883. This is statistically significant and a much better score than our previous. However, going into the Modern 3 tests, even though again we are CPU bottlenecked heavily, we see no difference, clocking in at an average of 230 FPS and 1% lows of 177. Almost the exact same as the last test by about 1 FPS, which is obviously in margin of error. Next, another extreme overclock. We have overclocked our CPU all-core to 5.1 GHz with no undervolt. And this i9-10850K sucks down power and puts out heat like nobody's business. It's reaching up to 1.5 volts thanks to my motherboard's automatic voltage configurations. Thank you, Gigabyte. And it's sucking almost 250 watts at max capacity. And it's peaking at about 90 degrees Celsius, even with direct die cooling, liquid metal, and custom water cooling all on top of each other. But all of that leads up to an 899.5, so close, score in Cinebench multi-core. Now, this is where I'm going to mention the Unigine superposition test. In this test, we dropped down to a score of 7088, which is weird because it was much lower than every other test on both tries. The only thing I can think of is the extra heat output or power output was sucking away from the GPU. But this trend isn't followed later into the guide, and I will show you the examples later. And in Modern Warfare 3, it got an overall average of 229 FPS with 1% lows of 177. Nothing too significant, even for this major overclock. Again, with the CPU reverted to stock settings, we now drift into the GPU category. I've given it a gracious overclock of 135 MHz on the core with 110% power target. No memory overclock here because my card can't handle it. And now would be a good time to mention that this is a Gaming Z Trio 12GB. However, it's been flashed with the Supreme X BIOS, so it can pull upwards of 400 watts from the wall. Now, the Cinebench score was a disappointing 837.5 when averaged. I'm pretty sure this is just a fluke. However, I decided to include it in the data points as it was interesting. Next is Unigine Superposition. And with a score of 7,383.5, this is actually a rather big difference over baseline, coming in at nearly 300 points higher overall. And lastly, our Modern Warfare 3 test sees its first noticeable gains in terms of FPS, clocking in at an average FPS of 237.5 with 1% lows higher than ever at 182 FPS. Now that we've covered each category individually, now we're going to move into the total overclock schemes. One is going to be balanced, and one of them is going to be extreme. The first one we are testing is the balanced overclocking profile. It's going to combine the balanced CPU and the balanced RAM settings along with our GPU overclock. There's only one GPU overclock. And we start off strong with a Cinebench score of 875, on par with a margin of error of the last balanced overclock of the CPU. Next, on to superposition with a score of 7,373. We hang on to our high score from the last GPU overclock. And finally, in the Modern Warfare 3 benchmark, we see an average FPS exactly the same as just the GPU overclock, coming in at 237.5 FPS with a 1% low of 181.5, again almost exactly matching the previous test. And our final category is, of course, the extreme overclock, combining the extreme CPU profile with the extreme RAM profile, and again, my GPU overclock. Our Cinebench scores come out higher than ever at 900, finally achieving the score that I wanted, and of course breaking into the 900s on average. Superposition, interestingly, comes out at 7,363.5, the lowest of the GPU overclock bunch. However, again, I would say this is within margin of error, or possibly due to the extra heat generated by our previous overclocks, which led to higher temperatures in the loop overall and might have led to a little bit of a lower core clock. And lastly, we have the Modern Warfare 3 test. We have the highest average FPS yet of 238 and the highest 1% lows of 183.5. Now, all of that combined here into this final chart in which we have our baseline stock setting at 100% and everything else has been adjusted in relation to this. And when we put the data into a chart like this, it all becomes pretty clear. First of all, not having XMP on slaughtered our test results in Cinebench, as well as our average FPS and 1% lows. Although interestingly enough, superposition wasn't affected at all at 100%. Past turning on XMP, further RAM overclocks didn't seem to improve anything at all, because I'm sure that when you overclock RAM, it would probably do better on a RAM benchmark specifically. But that begs the question, who cares? If it's not actually contributing to gaming performance, which we see it is not, so it seems like the obvious solution is to just put it at the XMP defaults and just leave it be. Unless you're trying to get the highest scores possible on a benchmark, or you have slow RAM from the factory, in which case bumping up the clock speed seems like a reasonable idea. Other than that, overclocking your RAM is definitely a no-go. Now, onto the CPU overclock. Overclocking the CPU did lead to a higher Cinebench score of 102.8% and 104.7% respectively. However, literally no other test was affected by this. In fact, average FPS is almost exactly the same, but slightly less in both attempts, although the 1% lows are a bit higher, which I find interesting. Which, when you consider the fact that I'm heavily CPU bottlenecked, it doesn't really seem to stand to reason that a faster CPU wouldn't result in higher FPS. But here we are, it says that it doesn't. And so it begs the question, in the case of this overclock here, where I'm dumping massive amounts of power and heat into my system, why would I do that just for some stupid benchmark? If you have a modern CPU that has good boost clock algorithms and is fast enough for your needs, I see absolutely no reason why you should be overclocking in 2024, except for undervolting. That still makes sense because it can get rid of power and still allow you to boost clocks by giving you thermal headroom. Now, on to the last subsection of overclocks, which seem to be the very obvious choice for anybody who's actually wanting to do some overclocking, and that is the GPU category. Upping our GPU clock speed actually helped in more than just the GPU benchmark, but also giving us appreciable gains in average FPS and 1% lows overall, boosting each by about 8 or 9 FPS apiece, and in some cases 10 or more FPS apiece. However, that sounds impressive by itself, but when you actually look at the graph, this equals to about a 3% gain in FPS, which is really not that big of a deal when you consider the fact that, like I said, you're dumping way more power and heat into your system and degrading the silicon power overall. That being said, I'm going to keep my GPU overclocked because a lot of gamers, like me, enjoy our high refresh rate games. So a couple FPS towards 240 Hz really goes a long way. And then again, here we come over to our overall overclocks. This is our balanced profile and this is our extreme profile. And in both cases, they average out to just barely any increase at all. On the balanced overclock settings, we have a 3% overall increase, and this is averaging all of the increases across every single benchmark. And over here on the extreme benchmarks, we have a 4% increase. That's it. Overclocking your entire system, the highest it will possibly go, sucking down incredible amounts of power and putting out incredible amounts of heat, gives you 4% faster scores overall. And with the autopsy out of the way, I'm going to give my final prognosis. Overclocking is dead. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like down below. I put a lot of work into this video collecting and graphing data, and again, if you will, subscribe to the channel to help me hit my 800 subscriber goal by the end of April. Thank you for watching.